My name is Elena Brooks, and I am 29 years old. If you met me today, you would probably think I built my career with confidence that never wavered. You would see a woman who speaks comfortably in boardrooms, manages difficult clients without losing her composure, and somehow still smiles after long days that seem impossible to survive. What you wouldn't see is how close I came to losing both my marriage and everything I had worked for because the people closest to me confused success with betrayal. Looking back now, I realize the hardest part was never earning a promotion. The hardest part was watching the man I loved slowly believe everyone else's opinions before he believed mine. 3 years earlier, life felt much simpler. I worked as a marketing specialist at a growing creative agency in Chicago called Brightwave Media. The work was demanding, but I loved every part of it. Every campaign felt like a new puzzle waiting to be solved, and I enjoyed the pressure that came with impossible deadlines. My husband, Adrian Mercer, worked in the same company. We weren't on the same team, but our departments often collaborated, and that was actually how we had met several years before. We became friends first, then partners, and eventually husband and wife. At the beginning, it felt like we understood each other better than anyone else, because we both knew exactly what it was like to chase ambitious goals while trying to build a life together. Our apartment wasn't luxurious, but it felt like home because we had built it together one paycheck at a time. We didn't have children yet, and that wasn't because we didn't want them. It was a decision we had made together. We wanted to become financially secure first, travel a little, and establish our careers before starting a family. Every time relatives asked when we planned to have children, I would smile politely and say, "Soon enough." The truth was that we were happy with the life we were creating, and I believed there was no rush. Most mornings began before sunrise. Adrian usually left a little earlier than I did because his department started work first, while I used the extra time to prepare breakfast, pack our lunches, water the plants near the balcony, and make sure the apartment was tidy before leaving. After work, while many of my coworkers headed straight home, I often stayed another hour or two finishing presentations, reviewing campaign data, or helping teammates who were struggling with deadlines. By the time I reached home, I still cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, and prepared everything for the next day. It was exhausting, but I never saw it as a sacrifice. I believed we were building a future together, and every late night felt like another brick in that future. At Brightwave Media, I had developed a reputation for solving difficult problems. Whenever an important client threatened to leave or a campaign wasn't performing well, my manager usually asked me to take another look before giving up. I wasn't the smartest person in the office, but I worked harder than almost everyone around me. While others were satisfied once their tasks were finished, I constantly searched for better ideas, stronger strategies, and ways to improve every project. My coworkers often joked that I treated every presentation as though it decided my entire career. Maybe they were right. I simply believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing well. Adrian used to admire that about me. During our first years together, he proudly told friends that I was the most hardworking person he had ever met. If I doubted myself before a major presentation, he was always the first one to remind me how capable I was. He celebrated every compliment I received from clients and never seemed threatened by my success. Those memories would become painful later, because they reminded me that the man I eventually struggled to recognize had once been my biggest supporter. Our agency had recently hired a new managing director named Nathan Holloway. Unlike many executives, Nathan wasn't interested in office politics or impressing people with fancy speeches. He cared about results, and he noticed employees who consistently delivered them. He challenged everyone to think differently and encouraged us to present ideas directly to senior leadership instead of waiting for permission. Most employees admired him because he rewarded effort instead of favoritism, and that created opportunities for people willing to work harder. One afternoon, after I presented a difficult campaign strategy that helped us save one of the company's biggest clients, Nathan asked me to stay behind after the meeting. For a brief moment, I worried I had made a mistake. Instead, he thanked me for the amount of preparation that had gone into the presentation and said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. He told me that talent opened doors, but consistency kept them open. Then he encouraged me to start preparing for leadership responsibilities, because he believed I was capable of much more than my current position. I walked out of his office feeling excited, but also a little overwhelmed. I couldn't wait to tell Adrian. I imagined us celebrating over dinner, laughing the way we always did whenever something good happened. At that moment, I had no idea that my growing success at work would slowly become the center of conversations I wasn't even present for. While I focused on building my career, other people had already begun planting quiet doubts inside my husband's mind, and none of us realized that those small conversations would eventually change the direction of our marriage forever. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that looked ordinary from the outside, but something subtle had already begun to change beneath the surface. Brightwave Media had entered one of its busiest seasons of the year, with several major clients preparing to launch national campaigns at the same time. Everyone in the office was working longer hours. Conference rooms stayed occupied from morning until evening, and the coffee machines never seemed to stop running. I threw myself into the workload without complaining because this was exactly the kind of environment I enjoyed. Pressure had never intimidated me. If anything, it sharpened my focus. I arrived before most people, stayed after many had gone home, and gradually became the person managers called whenever a project started falling behind schedule. Every successful campaign brought more responsibility, and although the days were exhausting, I genuinely believed the hard work would benefit both Adrian and me in the long run. Adrian, however, wasn't having the same year. His department had recently gone through several management changes, projects were constantly delayed, and promotions had been placed on hold because of budget restructuring. None of that was his fault, and I reminded him of that whenever he became frustrated. He was intelligent, dependable, and respected by his team, but unlike me, he worked in a department where opportunities came slowly. Whenever he talked about feeling stuck, I encouraged him to apply for leadership training or volunteer for larger projects. He usually smiled, thanked me for believing in him, and changed the subject. At the time, I assumed he simply needed patience. Looking back now, I realize disappointment can quietly grow into insecurity when it remains unspoken for too long. One Friday evening, the company hosted a small networking event after work to celebrate landing two important new clients. Employees from different departments gathered in the lounge area, sharing food, talking about upcoming projects, and congratulating one another. Nathan spent most of the evening speaking with different teams, thanking people individually for their contributions. Near the end of the event, he walked over to our group, congratulated me on the presentation that had helped secure one of the new accounts, and mentioned that he wanted me to lead the strategy meetings for the campaign moving forward. It wasn't an official promotion, but it was a significant vote of confidence. Several coworkers applauded, and I felt both surprised and grateful. Adrian smiled politely beside me, but I noticed his smile disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. As we prepared to leave, one of Adrian's coworkers, Ryan Carter, laughed and nudged him on the shoulder. "Looks like you'll be reporting to your wife one day," he joked loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. A few people chuckled because they assumed it was harmless office humor. Adrian forced a laugh as well, but I caught the brief expression on his face before it disappeared. It wasn't anger, it was embarrassment. I squeezed his hand as we walked toward the parking lot and reminded him that promotions weren't competitions. We were on the same team. He smiled again and agreed, but something about that smile felt different. It didn't reach his eyes. Over the following days, I noticed little changes that were easy to dismiss individually. Adrian became quieter whenever I talked about work. Conversations that used to last an hour suddenly ended after a few minutes. If I excitedly described a successful client meeting, he nodded politely before changing the topic. I convinced myself he was simply stressed by everything happening in his own department. Marriage teaches you to give each other space during difficult periods, and that's exactly what I tried to do. A week later, we attended a small dinner hosted by Adrian's Aunt Linda, who had always been closely involved in his life. She was the kind of person who had an opinion about everything and rarely kept those opinions to herself. At first, the evening felt warm and comfortable. Family members laughed over dinner, shared old stories, and asked about work. Naturally, someone mentioned the recent success of the campaigns at my office, and before I could answer, Aunt Linda smiled and said, "Elena has become quite the little star at work, hasn't she?" I laughed awkwardly and thanked her, assuming she meant it as a compliment. Then she turned toward Adrian with a smile that didn't feel quite as friendly. "Just don't let her become your boss," she said lightly. "Men don't usually enjoy that very much." Several people laughed, treating it like another harmless joke. I looked at Adrian, expecting him to laugh it off the way he normally would, but instead he simply smiled politely and reached for his glass. Before the conversation moved on, Aunt Linda added one more sentence that stayed with me long after dinner ended. "Power changes people," she said, "especially when one spouse starts climbing faster than the other." No one argued with her. No one even challenged the comment. It simply floated through the room before disappearing beneath another conversation. On the drive home, Adrian barely spoke, and although I asked him twice whether something was bothering him, he insisted he was only tired. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But sometimes the most dangerous doubts aren't the ones shouted during arguments. They're the quiet ones planted by people who smile while they say them, leaving someone else to water them long after the conversation is over. The promotion changed my position at Brightwave Media almost overnight, but it didn't change who I was. On Monday morning, I walked into the office carrying the same notebook, drinking the same coffee, and greeting the same people I had worked beside for years. The only real difference was that I now had additional responsibilities. I was expected to lead strategy meetings, coordinate with department heads, and report directly to Nathan on the progress of our biggest client. It was everything I had worked toward for years, yet instead of feeling proud without hesitation, I found myself wondering how Adrian was handling it. I wanted my success to feel like our success, not something that created distance between us. At first, Adrian insisted everything was fine. He congratulated me again, kissed me goodbye every morning, and even joked that I was becoming too important for him. I laughed because it sounded harmless, but over the following days, I noticed little things that didn't quite fit. Whenever I stayed late because of an urgent client meeting, he asked exactly who had attended. If I mentioned Nathan's name during dinner, Adrian became unusually quiet for a few moments before changing the subject. He never sounded angry or controlling. Instead, he sounded like someone trying to convince himself that the answers he was hearing were enough. Meanwhile, the office had begun treating me differently as well. Most of my coworkers were supportive, but promotions have a strange way of revealing people's insecurities. Employees who had once happily shared ideas with me suddenly became more careful around me. A few avoided conversations altogether, while others became unusually friendly. Ryan belonged to neither group. If anything, he seemed more interested in Adrian than in me. Several times, I noticed the two of them talking privately in the break room or standing together in the parking lot after work. Every time I approached, the conversation changed naturally enough that I never thought much about it. Looking back, I wish I had trusted the uncomfortable feeling I couldn't quite explain. That Friday, Nathan asked me to accompany him to a client presentation across town. It wasn't unusual. The campaign had entered an important stage, and as lead campaign strategist, I was expected to present several sections of the proposal myself. The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours, ending much later than anyone had expected. By the time we returned to the office, most employees had already gone home. Nathan thanked me for handling several difficult questions from the client and mentioned that the presentation had probably secured another long-term contract for the agency. I thanked him, packed my laptop, and hurried to the parking garage without giving the day another thought. Unfortunately, someone else had been watching. As Nathan and I walked toward our cars, Ryan happened to be leaving the building. He waved casually as we said goodnight to each other, but there was something about the smile on his face that made me uncomfortable. I dismissed the feeling almost immediately because there was nothing unusual about two coworkers leaving after the same meeting. That evening, Adrian seemed distracted during dinner. Halfway through the meal, he casually asked whether I had spent the entire afternoon at the office. I explained that I had been with Nathan at the client presentation and even showed him the presentation schedule on my phone. He nodded without saying much, but after several seconds he quietly asked, "Were you two alone?" I smiled gently and reminded him that client meetings usually included half a dozen people from both companies. He apologized and said he was only curious because Ryan had mentioned seeing the two of us leaving the building together after everyone else had gone home. For the first time, I felt a small knot form in my stomach, not because Adrian had asked the question, but because someone else had felt the need to tell him. I tried to laugh it off and explained that Nathan had parked on the same level of the garage. We simply happened to walk in the same direction after the meeting ended. Adrian accepted the explanation, but something about his expression told me the conversation hadn't really ended inside his mind. Over the next week, similar comments appeared from different directions. Aunt Linda casually mentioned during a phone call that people often became too close after working late together. Adrian's older sister repeated something she had supposedly heard from a mutual acquaintance who also worked in marketing. Even Ryan continued making harmless-looking jokes whenever Adrian was nearby, joking that the new leadership team seemed inseparable these days. None of those comments meant anything on their own, but together they slowly built a story I knew wasn't true, and the most dangerous lies are rarely created all at once. They're built one innocent conversation at a time until someone you love begins believing them without ever realizing it. The following weeks became some of the busiest of my career. The national retail campaign had entered its final stage, and every decision mattered. My days were filled with strategy meetings, client calls, creative reviews, and endless revisions. Sometimes I didn't leave the office until after 7 in the evening, but I made a promise to myself that no matter how demanding work became, I wouldn't let my marriage suffer because of it. Every morning, I still woke up early to prepare breakfast before Adrian left for work. Every evening I came home, cooked dinner, cleaned the apartment, folded laundry, and made sure we still spent at least a little time together before going to bed. I wanted him to know that no promotion could ever replace the life we had built together. Unfortunately, while I was trying harder than ever to protect our relationship, someone else was working just as hard to convince Adrian that he was slowly losing me. It started with small remarks that seemed almost impossible to challenge. Ryan casually mentioned that Nathan had praised my work again during a management meeting. A few days later, he joked that I was becoming the boss's favorite employee. Another coworker laughed and added that people who worked that closely together usually became friends outside the office too. Everyone laughed as though it was harmless office humor, but I noticed Adrian becoming quieter every time comments like those were made. He never confronted anyone. He simply listened, smiled politely, and carried those words home with him. Around the same time, Aunt Linda began calling Adrian more frequently. She had always been close to him, but now every conversation somehow returned to my career. She told him successful women sometimes changed after promotions. She reminded him that money and power could make people forget where they came from. Then she would soften her words by saying she was only worried because she loved him. None of it sounded like direct criticism. It sounded like concern. That was what made it so effective. Doubt grows much faster when it arrives disguised as advice. One evening, our agency hosted a formal dinner to celebrate the successful launch of the campaign. Employees were encouraged to bring their spouses, and I was genuinely excited because I thought Adrian would finally see that everything people had been implying was completely ridiculous. The event was held at a downtown hotel, with music playing softly while employees and clients talked about future projects. Nathan spent most of the evening introducing department leaders to important clients and thanking everyone for their hard work. When he reached our table, he warmly shook Adrian's hand and spent several minutes complimenting my dedication, telling him how fortunate the company was to have someone as committed as me leading the campaign. Adrian smiled politely and thanked him. From where I stood, the conversation couldn't have been more professional. Then everything changed because of one careless moment. As Nathan walked away, one of the senior account managers laughed and said, "Nathan, if Elena keeps saving every project, you'll have to give her your office next." Nathan laughed and replied, "At this rate, she might deserve it." It was nothing more than a joke. Everyone laughed. Everyone except Adrian. On the drive home, he barely spoke. I tried talking about the evening, asking whether he had enjoyed meeting everyone, but his answers became shorter and shorter. Finally, after several minutes of silence, he quietly asked me something that caught me completely off guard. "Do you think Nathan treats you differently than everyone else?" For a moment, I genuinely thought he was joking. When I realized he wasn't, my heart sank. I calmly explained that Nathan treated every employee according to their performance. Several other managers had also received public praise that evening, but Adrian simply stared out the passenger window without responding. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. That night, after we went to bed, I couldn't fall asleep. Adrian lay beside me, staring at the ceiling, thinking I was already asleep. After several minutes, he quietly reached for his phone. I wasn't trying to invade his privacy. I only happened to glance toward the screen when its light reflected across the room. The name at the top of the conversation wasn't Ryan. It wasn't Nathan. It was Aunt Linda. And the last message she had sent only a few minutes earlier read, "Just be careful, Adrian. Men usually notice these things after it's already too late." For the first time since all of this had begun, I realized something that sent a chill through me. This wasn't just office gossip anymore. Someone was deliberately feeding Adrian's fears, and whoever started it clearly wasn't planning to stop. The message stayed in my mind long after I saw it, but I chose not to mention it. I wasn't interested in searching through Adrian's phone or confronting him over a private conversation with his aunt. Marriage cannot survive if both people begin investigating each other instead of talking. I convinced myself that if I continued being honest, patient, and transparent, whatever doubts had found their way into his mind would eventually disappear on their own. I had no idea that while I was trying to save our relationship through trust, other people were quietly strengthening it through suspicion. The following week, Brightwave Media entered its busiest period yet. Our biggest client requested several last-minute changes before the campaign launch, and Nathan asked the leadership team to stay late for 3 consecutive evenings. Every department was under pressure, and nobody complained because everyone understood how important the account had become. Those late nights weren't glamorous. Most of the time, we were sitting around conference tables, surrounded by cold coffee, unfinished sandwiches, laptops, and stacks of printed reports. By the time we finally left the office, everyone looked exhausted rather than excited. On Thursday evening, after another 10-hour workday, I stopped at a grocery store on my way home because I knew Adrian had mentioned wanting to make homemade pasta over the weekend. I bought his favorite pasta, fresh vegetables, and the dark chocolate he always reached for whenever work became stressful. It wasn't a special occasion. I simply wanted to do something thoughtful because I felt we had both been living under constant pressure lately. I hoped a quiet weekend together might remind us why we had always worked so well as a team. When I arrived home, Adrian was already there. He thanked me for the groceries, smiled politely, and even helped put everything away. For a little while, things almost felt normal again. We cooked dinner together, watched a television show, and laughed about an embarrassing mistake one of my coworkers had made during a presentation. I remember thinking that perhaps I had worried for nothing. Maybe we were finally moving past the awkwardness of the last few weeks. Then my phone buzzed. It was an email from Nathan. He had sent the updated presentation schedule for Monday's client meeting and asked everyone on the leadership team to review it before the morning. I opened it for less than a minute, replied that I had received it, and placed my phone back on the table. Adrian didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he quietly asked, "Does he usually email you this late?" I explained that he had sent the exact same message to everyone on the project team. It wasn't personal. It was simply the fastest way to make sure nobody missed the schedule changes before Monday. He nodded slowly, but his expression didn't relax. The next morning, while I was making coffee before work, I accidentally left my phone charging on the kitchen counter. When I returned a few minutes later, Adrian quickly stepped away from it. He smiled and told me someone had called, but it had only been a spam number. His explanation sounded perfectly reasonable, yet something deep inside me felt unsettled. Not because I believed he had done anything terrible, but because I suddenly realized we had reached a point where curiosity was beginning to replace trust. Later that afternoon, Priya invited me to lunch in the small cafe across the street from the office. Halfway through our meal, she looked at me with an unusual seriousness and quietly asked if everything was all right between Adrian and me. I was surprised because I hadn't discussed our marriage with anyone at work. When I asked why she was asking, she hesitated before admitting that she had overheard Ryan telling another coworker that Adrian had become convinced Nathan was paying far too much attention to me. According to Ryan, everyone would find out the truth sooner or later. I stared at her in complete disbelief. There was no truth to find. There had never been anything between Nathan and me except a professional working relationship. For the first time, I realized this wasn't harmless gossip anymore. Someone was deliberately creating a story, and the frightening part wasn't that strangers might believe it. The frightening part was that the person I loved most was slowly beginning to believe it too. As I drove home that evening, one question kept repeating itself in my mind. How many lies does it take before someone starts doubting the person they've trusted for years? I didn't know the answer, but I had a feeling I was about to find out the hard way. The drive home that evening felt longer than usual. Priya's words kept replaying in my mind, not because I believed the rumors mattered, but because I couldn't understand why Ryan seemed so determined to spread them. Office gossip usually faded within a few days before people found something new to talk about. This was different. Every time the rumors should have disappeared, someone found a new way to keep them alive. By the time I pulled into our apartment parking lot, I had already decided that I wasn't going to let whispers from the office damage the life Adrian and I had built together. We had always promised each other that if something was wrong, we would talk about it instead of listening to everyone else. I still believed we could keep that promise. When I opened the apartment door, I found Adrian sitting at the dining table with his laptop open but untouched. He looked up, smiled faintly, and asked how my day had been. I answered honestly, telling him about another long meeting and the final preparations for the client launch. For a few minutes, the conversation felt natural again. Then he asked whether Nathan had been in those meetings all day. I nodded because, of course, he had. Nathan was leading the entire project. Adrian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stirred his coffee slowly before asking whether the two of us ever had meetings alone. The question caught me off guard. I gently explained that leadership discussions sometimes happen one-on-one, just as they did in every department, but they were always about campaign strategy, deadlines, or client decisions. There was nothing unusual about them. Adrian nodded, yet I could tell he was searching my face as though hoping to find something I wasn't saying. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. For the first time since we had been married, I felt as though honesty alone was no longer enough. The weekend arrived, and I suggested we spend Saturday away from work completely. We drove to a nearby lakeside park, rented a small paddle boat, shared lunch at a quiet cafe, and spent hours walking along the water. For most of the afternoon, it felt like we had found each other again. We laughed about old memories from our first apartment, joked about how terrible we had been at cooking during our first year of marriage, and even started talking about taking a vacation after the campaign ended. Watching Adrian smile like that reminded me why I had fallen in love with him. Beneath all the recent tension, he was still the thoughtful, kind man I had married. That evening, however, everything shifted again. As we walked back toward the parking lot, Adrian's phone rang. It was Ryan. Adrian answered casually, but I noticed his expression changing within seconds. He listened without speaking, thanked Ryan quietly, and ended the call. When I asked what had happened, he hesitated before saying that Ryan had been working late at the office and claimed he had seen Nathan's car parked outside the building, even though it was Saturday. I frowned in confusion. So, Adrian looked at me for a moment before quietly asking, "He said your car was there too." I felt my heart sink. "My car is there," I replied calmly, "because I left it at the office yesterday and we came here in your car this morning. I told you that before we left." His face immediately changed. For a brief moment, I could actually see the realization crossing his mind. He remembered. I had told him. He apologized almost instantly, saying he had forgot. I smiled and told him it was all right. But deep inside, something had changed. It wasn't the accusation that frightened me. It was how quickly someone else's words had become believable enough for him to question me before remembering the truth. As we drove home in silence, neither of us realized that Ryan wasn't inventing these stories by himself anymore. Someone inside the office was quietly helping him, and within a few days, I would accidentally discover exactly who it was. Monday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy that only comes before an important client presentation. Brightwave Media was quieter than usual because everyone was focused on the same goal. Our largest client would arrive within a few hours, and months of planning depended on what happened inside one conference room. I pushed everything else out of my mind and concentrated on the work in front of me. Whatever problems Adrian and I were facing at home could wait until the evening. At least, that's what I told myself. The presentation went better than any of us expected. The client asked difficult questions, challenged several parts of the campaign, and requested last-minute adjustments, but our team handled every concern calmly. Nathan thanked each department individually before the meeting ended, and when the clients finally left, the room broke into relieved applause. As everyone gathered their laptops and notes, Nathan asked me to stay behind for a few minutes to discuss the rollout schedule for the following week. It wasn't unusual. I was leading the campaign, and there were still dozens of decisions that needed approval before launch day. 10 minutes later, I walked out of the conference room carrying a folder full of revised timelines. As I rounded the corner toward my office, I slowed down when I heard familiar voices coming from the empty break room nearby. I wasn't trying to listen, but the door had been left slightly open, and one name immediately caught my attention. Adrian still believes everything I've told him, Ryan said with a quiet laugh. Another voice answered. It belonged to Melissa Harper, one of the senior account executives who had unsuccessfully applied for the same promotion I had received a few weeks earlier. I told you he'd crack eventually, she replied. He's already insecure enough. All we had to do was keep reminding him how much time Elena spends with Nathan. Ryan chuckled. The funny part is we've never actually caught them doing anything. Melissa laughed softly before answering. We don't have to, people believe what they're already afraid of. My entire body froze. For several long seconds I couldn't move. Every rumor, every joke, every casual comment. None of it had been accidental. It had been planned. Melissa continued speaking, her voice completely calm. Nathan wanted Elena on the leadership team from the beginning. If enough drama follows her around, senior management might decide she's more trouble than she's worth. Maybe next time the promotion goes to someone else. Ryan laughed again. I almost feel bad for Adrian, Melissa shrugged. I don't. I quietly stepped away before either of them noticed I was standing there. My hands were trembling so badly that I nearly dropped the folder I was carrying. For weeks, I had been questioning myself, wondering whether I had somehow failed to reassure Adrian enough. Now, I finally understood the truth. Someone had been deliberately destroying both my professional reputation and my marriage because they couldn't accept losing a promotion. That afternoon, I barely spoke to anyone. I finished my work, packed my laptop, and left the office earlier than usual. During the drive home, I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, wishing I had recorded it. Without proof, it would sound like nothing more than my word against theirs. As I pulled into our apartment parking lot, another thought crossed my mind. If Ryan had spent weeks manipulating Adrian, how much damage had already been done? And for the first time since all of this had started, I wasn't afraid of the rumors anymore. I was afraid that even the truth might no longer be enough to save my marriage. That evening, I sat in my car for almost 10 minutes before going upstairs. My hands were still wrapped around the steering wheel as I replayed every word I had overheard in the break room. Part of me wanted to march back into the office the next morning, confront Ryan and Melissa in front of everyone, and demand an explanation. Another part of me knew that people willing to invent lies were usually just as willing to deny them. Without proof, the conversation I had overheard would become nothing more than my word against theirs. I had worked too hard to build my reputation to risk destroying it through an emotional confrontation. So I made a different decision. If they wanted to play games behind closed doors, I would let the truth expose them instead. When I walked into the apartment, Adrian was already preparing dinner. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen, and for a brief moment I almost forgot everything that had happened. He smiled when he saw me, kissed my forehead, and asked how the client meeting had gone. I told him the presentation had been successful and that the client had officially approved the campaign. He congratulated me sincerely, and for a few minutes we talked like we used to, laughing about small things and planning a quiet weekend once the project finally launched. Watching him smile made what I had overheard at work even more painful. He wasn't my enemy. He was being manipulated by people who understood exactly where his insecurities lived. After dinner, while we cleaned the kitchen together, Adrian suddenly became unusually quiet. He dried the last plate, placed it carefully in the cupboard, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger, it was hesitation. Finally, he asked if he could ask me something without me getting upset. I smiled gently and told him he could ask me anything. He took a slow breath before speaking. Have you ever hidden anything from me about work? The question hurt more than I expected, not because I had anything to hide, but because I realized he had reached a point where he genuinely needed to ask. I looked him straight in the eyes and answered honestly, no, not once. He nodded, but I could tell he was fighting something inside his own mind. After a long silence, he admitted that Ryan had been talking to him almost every day during lunch breaks. At first, the conversations had been harmless, but gradually Ryan began mentioning how often Nathan praised me, how frequently we worked together, and how people around the office had started noticing it. Adrian insisted he hadn't wanted to believe any of it, yet hearing the same story repeated by different people over and over had made it harder to ignore. I didn't interrupt him. I simply listened. When he finished, I quietly asked one question. Did you ever think about asking me before believing them? The apartment became completely silent. He lowered his eyes and whispered, I thought I was protecting myself from getting hurt. I felt tears gathering in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I walked over to him, gently took his hand, and said something I had been holding inside for weeks. The saddest part is that while you were trying to protect yourself from something I never did, you stopped protecting us. He couldn't answer. For the first time since all of this had begun, I saw genuine regret on his face. That night, after Adrian had gone to bed, I stayed awake in the living room with my laptop open. Instead of thinking about my marriage, I started reviewing weeks of emails, meeting schedules, calendar invitations, and project records. If Ryan and Melissa wanted everyone to believe I had been secretly spending time alone with Nathan, then the company's own records would prove otherwise. Every meeting had attendees. Every client visit had schedules. Every late evening at the office had security logs and email timestamps. As I organized everything into a single folder, one thought became clearer than ever. I wasn't gathering evidence because I wanted revenge. I was gathering it because I had finally realized something important. The truth deserves more than hope. Sometimes, it deserves proof. The following morning, I walked into the office with a level of calm that surprised even me. For weeks, I had carried the weight of other people's assumptions on my shoulders, constantly wondering what conversations were taking place after I left a room, or why certain people suddenly looked at me differently. That feeling was gone. I had stopped trying to control what everyone else believed. My only responsibility now was to protect the truth. As I settled into my desk, I opened the folder I had created the night before and carefully organized every email, meeting invitation, project timeline, and client schedule in chronological order. Looking at everything together, one fact became impossible to ignore. Every single hour Ryan had implied I was secretly spending alone with Nathan had actually been documented as work. There were witnesses, meeting notes, presentation drafts, and client feedback attached to nearly every day. The rumors only sounded convincing because most people had never bothered checking the facts. Around mid-morning, Nathan stopped by my desk and asked if I had a few minutes to review the final presentation before next week's executive meeting. We walked into one of the conference rooms together, and as we discussed the campaign strategy, I noticed Ryan walking past the glass wall outside. He slowed down just enough to glance inside before continuing down the hallway. 10 minutes later, Melissa walked by and did exactly the same thing. They didn't know I had already overheard their conversation in the break room. but seeing them watching us only confirmed that they were still trying to build a story that didn't exist. When the meeting ended, Nathan remained seated for a moment before speaking. He thanked me for the months of hard work I had invested in the campaign and admitted that promoting me had been one of the easiest professional decisions he had ever made. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He explained that over the past week, he had noticed unusual behavior around the office. Certain employees had started asking strangely personal questions about our working relationship, while others seemed uncomfortable whenever the two of us spoke. Nathan had managed teams for nearly 20 years, and he recognized office gossip the moment he saw it. He looked directly at me and asked if anyone had been making me uncomfortable. For a brief moment, I considered pretending everything was fine. That had been my habit for a long time, but pretending had never solved anything. I took a slow breath and calmly told him everything. I explained how the promotion had changed the atmosphere, how Ryan had started making subtle comments, how Melissa had been spreading rumors, and how those rumors had even begun affecting my marriage. Nathan listened without interrupting me once. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair with a disappointed expression that had nothing to do with me. He quietly admitted that this wasn't the first time he had seen talented employees become targets after receiving promotions. Jealousy, he said, often looked for the easiest explanation because accepting someone else's success required accepting your own limitations. It was much easier for people to believe that favoritism or an affair explained a promotion than to admit someone had simply worked harder. Then his expression became more serious. He told me that if the rumors had reached my home, they had gone far beyond harmless office gossip. At that point, they had become a workplace conduct issue, and the company had a responsibility to investigate. I wasn't expecting those words. I had spent weeks believing this was my personal problem to solve. For the first time, someone else recognized that what had happened wasn't simply unfair. It was wrong. That afternoon, Nathan contacted Human Resources and requested a confidential meeting for the following morning. He assured me that the purpose wasn't to create drama or embarrass anyone, but to establish the facts before the rumors damaged more lives. As I left his office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time: relief, not because the problem had disappeared, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. Meanwhile, on the other side of the office, Ryan watched me walk back to my desk before turning toward Melissa. He quietly smiled and whispered that everything was working exactly as they had planned. Neither of them realized that while they believed they were controlling the story, the truth had already started writing its own ending. The following morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was still quiet, with only a handful of employees settling into their desks. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window for a few minutes, reminding myself why I was there. I wasn't walking into a meeting to punish anyone. I wasn't looking for revenge, and I certainly wasn't trying to embarrass my coworkers. I simply wanted the truth to exist in the same room as the lies that had been repeated for weeks. Whatever happened after that would be the result of choices other people had made, not mine. At 9 o'clock, Nathan, the Human Resources Director, and I met in one of the executive conference rooms. They had already reviewed my emails, project schedules, security access logs, meeting calendars, and client records. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Every late evening I had spent in the office had been connected to project deadlines. Every meeting with Nathan had been scheduled through the company's calendar system and attended by other employees whenever required. There wasn't a single unexplained meeting, private trip, or unusual expense that supported the rumors circulating around the office. The evidence wasn't merely convincing, it was complete. About 20 minutes later, Ryan and Melissa were asked to join the meeting separately. At first, both of them appeared confident. Ryan smiled politely as though he had no idea why he had been called in, while Melissa greeted everyone with her usual cheerful expression. That confidence lasted only a few minutes. The Human Resources Director calmly explained that several workplace rumors had been reported and that the company needed to understand where they had started. Ryan immediately claimed he had only repeated concerns he had heard from other people. Melissa said she never intended to spread gossip, and insisted she had simply been worried because she thought Nathan and I spent an unusual amount of time together. Then Nathan quietly placed the meeting schedules, security records, and client documentation on the table and asked a simple question. If you believed something inappropriate was happening, why didn't either of you report it to human resources instead of discussing it with half the office? Neither of them answered. The silence grew heavier when the human resources director explained that several employees had already confirmed hearing the same rumors directly from Ryan and Melissa. One by one, the stories began falling apart. Their timelines didn't match. Their explanations contradicted each other. Every assumption they had made collapsed the moment it was compared with actual records. Finally, Ryan lowered his head and admitted that after my promotion, he had convinced himself Nathan must have favored me because he couldn't accept that my performance had been stronger than his own. Melissa quietly admitted that she had repeated the rumors without knowing whether any of them were true because everyone else seemed willing to believe them. The room became completely silent. Nathan looked at both of them with obvious disappointment before speaking. He explained that promotions were based on measurable results, leadership, client satisfaction, and months of documented performance, not personal friendships. He reminded them that professional jealousy was understandable, but attacking another employee's reputation to satisfy that jealousy crossed a line the company could never ignore. Then he turned toward me and apologized on behalf of the organization for allowing the situation to continue long enough to affect my personal life. Hearing those words brought an unexpected lump to my throat. For weeks, I had been questioning myself. Now, someone in authority was finally saying what I had needed to hear all along. Later that afternoon, Human Resources announced that Ryan would be removed from the campaign and placed under formal disciplinary action for workplace misconduct. Melissa received a final written warning and was required to complete professional conduct training before returning to the project. The announcement didn't include unnecessary details, but everyone in the office understood exactly why those decisions had been made. Conversations stopped whenever I walked past, not because people were judging me anymore, but because they finally realized how easily they had believed a story without ever asking whether it was true. When I returned home that evening, Adrian was already waiting in the living room. He stood up the moment I opened the door, and before I could even set my bag down, he quietly asked how the meeting had gone. I told him everything, from the investigation to Ryan's confession and Nathan's apology. As I spoke, I watched the guilt spread across his face. By the time I finished, tears had begun filling his eyes. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "They lied to me, but I still should have trusted you." For a few seconds, neither of us moved. I knew that apology was real, but I also knew that forgiveness and trust were never the same thing. And deep inside, I realized that the hardest decision of my life was still waiting for both of us.